lectures when I taught at the University of Oklahoma, and I've told Mark this. Mark is a past president of the Masonic Library and Museum Association, a fellow and past board member of the Masonic Society, a Cubs fan, and a past secretary of the Masonic Restoration Foundation. Mark worked on his book while a member of the 2018-2019 class of research fellows here at the Washington Library at Mount Vernon. He joins us tonight to discuss his new book, A Deserving Brother, George Washington and Freemasonry. Talk about this book. This is an important subject, and not a subject that is unknown to people. People often associate George Washington and Freemasonry, but I want to start with some of the basics.
Sure.
Kind of define our terms. What is Freemasonry? That's a big one. And where did it come from? When did it come from?
Sure. Okay. So Freemasonry is fundamentally a fraternal organization, and sometimes those are complicated topic or subject, but fraternal organization would be Freemasonry, the Oddfellows, the Grange, the Knights of Pythias, the Woodsmen of the World. These were very, very popular organizations 150 years ago.
This is something I think a lot of people associate George Washington with Freemasonry. They might know that he was a Freemason. They might know that he was a part of an important Masonic ceremony here or there. But your book really dives in. Let's go back to the very beginning, though. What is Freemasonry? Where did it come from? When did it begin?
Okay, so Freemasonry is a fraternal organization that was essentially founded in Great Britain, but more specifically Scotland. And it's basically, nobody knows where it comes from exactly. There's not one founder like Paul Harrison invented the Rotary Club, or Walt Disney created the Walt Disney Company. So Freemasonry, it grows over time out of Scotland from roughly 1599, when out of stonemasons guilds, into the 1720s, where it's formally organized into a Grand Lodge in London. And during those decades, obviously, British society and Scottish society went through great transformations, but Freemasonry essentially turned into a club and became sort of part of the Enlightenment, and as a means for new information and new scientific discoveries, new discussions about politics, whatever, growing, and a growing middle class, they needed a place to meet, and Freemasonry became that form of club that was organized. And then it developed more towards self-improvement and benevolent purposes by the 1730s, as it came into the North American continent and spread through the British Empire. So the first lodges of Freemasons are formed in Boston and Philadelphia in the 1730s, and 20 years later is when George Washington joined the lodge in Fredericksburg.
So you mentioned a guild, the Stonemasons Guild, and you mentioned the emerging world of clubs and societies in Great Britain, or in England and into Great Britain in the 17th and 18th centuries. Why would stonemasonry give a good sort of foundation for a club like that? I'm curious about the nature of stonemasonry and Freemasonry.
Sure. So stonemasonry in Scotland, the guild system, and if you've been to Scotland, nearly everything is built out of stone. But as the trade declined in the 1500s and 1600s, the stonemasons were losing business, and they were losing authority over the trade. So they started to invite gentlemen, non-stonemasons, to provide into their guilds to give patronage and support. Stonemasonry has a set of bylaws and constitutions that we would know called the ancient charges, like all guilds would have, according to their membership. Joining a stonemasons guild, you would start as an apprentice, and you'd become fellow of the craft, and then you would become a master craftsman. And that process were called degrees or advancement. And that structure, both locally and then later translated into a larger area such as Scotland or England, and then internationally. So stonemasonry provided the structure upon which Freemasonry later wrote its grand constitutions and the ways to organize. So Freemasonry is modeled after and based upon stonemasons' guild structure and rules and regulations.
And a lot of those symbols that we see when we see Masonic regalia, we see compasses, we see, can you talk us through a little bit of the symbolism?
So the symbols of Freemasonry come from stonemasons guilds and from stonemasonry. So the level teaches us to be equal, or on the level to teach each other equally. The plumb is the rectitude of life, to be upright in all things, and the square teaches us to square our actions by the square of virtue. So you take these symbols that represent some sort of abstract ideas, but they remain a sort of a concrete principle, and then they're rearranged in different forms in order to instruct the apprentice or the fellow or the master as they go through the degrees, and that provides, again, a structure and allows a form of instruction to the candidates in those principles of the fraternity, such as brotherly love, relief, truth, temperance, fortitude, prudence, and justice.
Right. So why, I hope I don't sound silly here, but why would George Washington have been interested in becoming a Freemason? All this stuff sounds great.
Yeah.
But, why would George Washington have sought it out?
So in the 1730s and 40s and 50s, Freemasonry is a phenomenon that's spreading throughout the British Empire. It's throughout, it's as far as India by the 1730s. It's up and down the eastern seaboard. It's in South America. It's in the Scandinavia. It's in Russia. It's everywhere, and it's a phenomenon.
Yeah.
And so if you're out on the frontier in Virginia, if you hear of that, or you meet men who have been to England or come from England, or Englishmen, and they are Freemasons, that's something that's curious to them. So curious to you, as you're circulating, as Washington is with the Fairfax family, and you're receiving news from England, this is something that's coming your way in the same way of any other kind of fad or phenomenon. And as a young man, Washington would see that as another avenue of advance into British society. So as he's contemplating joining the military, as he's traveling to Barbados with his sick half-brother, as he's moving into bigger circles amongst the Fairfaxes or other people in Northern Virginia, this is something that as a young man might do in the same way that, if a young man or young woman was aspiring to be to get a corporate job or to be a corporate executive, you would maybe take golf lessons when you're in your early 20s or in college. It's the same sort of notion that you would want to pick up that attribute so you could speak or you could be accepted in those circles who were aware of that organization.
You've spoken somewhat abstractly, so I'm curious, does Washington ever reflect on why he became a Freemason? Do you have any sense from him?
No. So, he joins when he comes back from Barbados after his half-brother dies. He receives the degrees over a period of about 8-9 months, and then right after that he goes off. He has his first mission off to Western Pennsylvania to go and tell the French to kindly leave the Forks of Ohio. So he's then for the next 2 or 3 years caught up in all that other material, and then serving in essentially what is the French and Indian War. Mm-hmm. And then when he comes back from the war, he marries Martha Custis, and then he's settled here. And then it's 20 years later before he's active in Freemasonry again. So there's not really any point in his life where he's reflective on that. And I think it just would be part of something that he did in his youth. He's certainly remembered and known by the members of his lodge in Fredericksburg. And then when he appears and is commissioned the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, people know he's a Freemason, but we're not really sure how they knew or why they knew. And it was something that as he got older and went during the war, it was something that he could have denied being a member or could have forgotten, but he clearly embraced it. And when Freemasons, members of the fraternity, approached him, he gladly accepted their invitations.
So let's go back to Fredericksburg.
Okay.
In those, you said 9 months across the time of.
Well, it would have been November of 1752 when he was initiated, and then August of 1753 when he received his third degree, Master Mason.
So what would he have experienced? I'm not a Mason, but I taught about this enough to know that we have some sense, a sense that even you could talk about it in a public setting.
Sure.
What would he have experienced across those 9 months?
So the Masonic initiation ceremony, while secretive and certainly private, of which Freemasons take an obligation not to discuss or to share, was exposed in various forms in various publications starting in the 1720s and is widely disseminated by the 1750s and by the 1790s. The ritual ceremony is basically essentially what every fraternal organization, college, Greek letter society is based on. Freemasonry is the model for that. So the initiation ceremony consists of 2 parts. The first part is being received into the lodge. The candidate is received in the lodge. He's examined in the sense that we make sure that he is who he says he is, and then he takes upon himself an obligation to uphold the rules of the fraternity, to live a good and fair life with his brothers, to care for widows and orphans and perform those sort of charitable things, and to live under the laws and bylaws of the fraternity. And then the second part of the ceremony would be an explanation of what are the tools and symbols, what are the principles of the fraternity, as articulated in relationship to the Freemasonry essential allegory, which is the building of King Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. So as you are in the entered apprentice degree, there are certain tools and symbols that relate to what apprentices do, such as fashioning rough stone. If you're fellow craft, there are tools and symbols that relate to fitting the stone to better use. And then the master mason symbol or tools, the trowel, which unites all the stones together. So those tools and symbols, or tools and symbols most expressive, teach those virtues to the candidate. And then later on, in many cases, the candidate is expected to memorize those lectures and then recite that material back to the lodge to demonstrate that he has learned it before he can proceed to the next degree.
I was just about to ask that. I know in more recent decades or centuries, there is a lot of memorization. Would George Washington have memorized quite a bit?
No, not at that time. I don't think it was a common thing at that time. Freemasonry's degrees and lectures were very, very basic and simple. Not simple in the sense of the language or the philosophy they conferred, but not complicated. One of the most important things that people often forget, and I think it's why I enjoy studying fraternalism, writing and producing ritual ceremonies is a literary genre. Yeah. So it takes levels of sophistication, and they're rewritten over a period of time. And because Freemasonry is a folk way, and it grows across the country, that's one of the beauties of any fraternal organization. When you go different places, you see the ritual performed different ways. So when Washington received the initiations, so far as we can tell, they are largely lectures given to him by the master of the lodge, who may or may not have memorized them. But later on, they are fully memorized. So when I was a master of my lodge in Massachusetts, I memorized 15 or 20 minutes worth of rituals for each 3 degrees. And in Virginia, to be a Freemason today, it's all conveyed mouth to ear. There's nothing written down. So all the rituals fully memorized. And that ritual memorization process is what helps create a fraternity between the man who's teaching the candidate and the candidate learning. So that's part of the fraternal process, yes.
I think you've been able to, or historians, and including you, have been able to understand the Fredericksburg Lodge, the membership list and all that. Yes. How many men would have been standing around George Washington at this time?
Very few. So we're thinking in Fredericksburg in 1752, 1753, the minute books are astonishingly survived. And when you think about how long those minute books have sat in that lodge, this is a lodge that has continually existed for 200 years, 230 years, I suppose. And the minute books are maintained, but the lodge spontaneously joined and organized as Freemasons found themselves on the frontier. Only later on, several years after Washington was initiated, that they go and get a proper charter from the Grand Lodge of Scotland to formally organize themselves. So there was maybe 10 or 12 men in the lodge when Washington joined. And then because it's a frontier society and transient, men are coming and going. Some of them are tobacco merchants or others, so they're going back to Scotland. They're coming back depending on the season and the trade. And then, of course, the economy and then what's going on in the frontier related to the war, especially in the 1750s, right?
Well, I want to skip to a different war.
Okay.
Because you mentioned there's a big gap in Washington's Masonic participation between the 1750s and the era of the American Revolution. Can you set the stage for the Revolutionary War era in terms of Freemasonry? I know there's a great work by a scholar named Stephen Bullock that dives deep in and says that Freemasonry was a key part of holding the Continental Army together. Right. Can you help us understand the broader context, and then we'll zoom in on George?
Sure. So Freemasonry, the statistics would be basically in 1750 or so, there's maybe 15 lodges in North America. By 1775, there's about 100 lodges up and down the East Coast. There's maybe 5 or 6 in Massachusetts, 5 or 6 in Connecticut, maybe 10 in New York or so, 10 in Philadelphia, one in Georgia, and only one in Georgia for 50 years. And so the fraternity ebbs and flows as far as its popularity and its interest, and it's slowly organizing itself because it's becoming more and more formal. Like any other folk way, just because you play a banjo this way over a period of time, the way the banjo is played or the styles that the banjo develops over 150 years of playing becomes more and more particular. And that's true with Freemasonry. So by the beginning of the American Revolution, there's about 100 lodges in North America. They're both lodges locally, and then regiments in the British Army, and then, of course, in the Continental Army, form lodges within their regiments. So, and this has been a practice in the British regimental system going back to the 1730s. It was a common thing. So the officers and the NCOs would have their own lodge within the regiment. And again, that just maintains esprit de corps and a sense of comradeship. And there's also a form of charity and benevolence in case the soldier is killed or captured, which I'll mention in a second. So Freemasonry at that time is just the means for communications and a means to move from town to town in the same way that if you were a member of the Union League Club, you could go and stay at the Union Club in Philadelphia, or you could go to Chicago, or you could go to New York, wherever the Union Club. It's a similar thing like that. And the level of propriety and the level of respectability would be the same, because Freemasonry then, and should be today, is very particular about who enters the lodge, and you have to ask to join the fraternity. So there is a qualification to get in. It's a test of being respectability and being a gentleman, certainly in Washington's day. So the fraternity, Freemasonry, is part and parcel of American society in the 1770s. Some of those men are more loyal to the crown, and some men are more rebellious in nature. So for every Paul Revere, who was an active Freemason and an open patriot, there's plenty of Freemasons who were stayed loyal, and including one of George Washington's best friends, George Mercer, who remained loyal and went back to England when the war happened. So, and Washington was at George Mercer's raising, or when George Mercer received the Master Mason's degree. So the fraternity provides a means for contact. So if you're in the Connecticut Regiment and you're serving in the military, and you're at battle, or you come in contact with a regiment from North Carolina, you may come across Freemasons. In the same way that members of the Constitution, the Continental Congress, were Freemasons of different colonies or different states, Freemasonry became a means of entrance and sort of a shared philosophy, or a point to start a conversation that would at least allow the opportunity to become friends before other differences or other differences of opinions may divide people apart.
And unlike some things, like a particular religious denomination, it's not something that's building on lines that help divide society.
Right. That's right. So one of the strengths of Freemasonry is, and always has been, is it is fundamentally a cosmopolitan organization. Right. So as early as the 1720s, there are obviously Protestants, Anglican, Christians, but there are Presbyterians, there are Jews in the lodge, or Roman Catholics in lodges in England. And then throughout the colonies and around the world, men of different faiths have joined the lodge. And so it's not divided by religious point of view. It's trying to unite men of different points of view, and that diversity has grown and grown over the centuries. So there are Masonic lodges in every country, with every kind of religion and every type of individual in those lodges, provided that they are of good moral quality.
But because of what you had said about the role in colonial society of sort of establishing oneself as a gentleman,
yes,
this is something that's largely confined to the officer corps?
Well, it broadens across. So somebody like, again, Paul Revere, if you think about, and this is what's revolutionary, what Steve Bullock talks about, and others, the revolution is not just simply a political separation from the British crown. It's a revolution as a republic. So you're bringing forth men of lower status into a higher status. They're taking charge of responsibilities. They're taking charge for their communities and lives, because there's no noble patronage and there's no aristocracy anymore. Yeah. So somebody like Paul Revere, who is a craftsman and a silversmith, he is rising in society and taking on greater and greater roles. He's not a founding father in the same way that Samuel Adams or John Adams is, or John Hancock, but he is important in his community in Boston, and in the 1790s, he becomes Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. So he becomes quite respectable in his lifetime, and Freemasonry is helping him and that whole class, a younger generation, move into those areas of responsibility as, towns and cities and counties and states are setting up governments and functioning in a new and particular way. And that's largely what's in the book, is these letters written by these new citizens writing to George Washington, looking for patronage, having grown up in an aristocracy, but still trying to meet as brothers on the level in a republic. And that's a large part of what Stephen Bullock talks about in his book.
You mentioned some Masonic participation during the war years on George Washington's part. Can you give us an example?
So Washington attends 3 lodge meetings during the War for Independence, and he's invited to a 4th, but he doesn't look like he attended. So there's a lodge called American Union Lodge that was formed in Connecticut in 1776 amongst the Connecticut regiments. They invite Washington to attend a couple different ceremonies in 1779, one in June and one in December. Freemasonry traditionally supports and celebrates the Feast of St. John, both St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist. And Freemasonry views those as their patron saints, but it marks sort of the beginning and the end of their Masonic year. And that's when officers are elected. So Washington attends 2 of those ceremonies. One is actually a closed meeting only for the brothers, and another is sort of a celebration, and there are non-Masons and wives and other people involved. And they take money for the poor. So Washington attends really, as a general of the Continental Army. He's in town, he's a Freemason, and he's there to sort of support what's going on. And again, it's a more of a form of esprit de corps and sociability than anything else, because it's a celebration. The 3rd meeting that he attends is in Poughkeepsie, New York, and I believe that's in 1781, and that's an odd story. We've always known that he attended this lodge in Poughkeepsie, but when you look in the details, he got on a horse with a comrade and rode 17 miles to go to this lodge meeting, and then rode back in the evening. It's not really clear why he went that far, just to go to a meeting where there's literally, the minute book show maybe 10 people attending, 10 brothers. So and then when Washington is invited to another lodge, there's a lodge, another regimental lodge that's formed that's actually named after him. It's the first lodge named Washington Lodge in the history of the United States, the history of the world. And he's invited to attend that lodge, but he's unable to make it, as far as we can tell. The last thing I would say about that, the lodge of the American Union Lodge, many of their members of that lodge were captured at the Battle of Long Island and the battle in Manhattan. And when they were prisoners of war in Manhattan, they formed a lodge amongst the prisoners. And the Tories, the loyalists in New York City, granted that lodge a charter. So these men were traitors to the crown, but they were still Freemasons, and they received a charter, and they met as Freemasons in the prisoner of war camp in New York. And this happens on and on and on through the history. There are lodges formed, informal lodges formed in prisoner of war camps throughout the history of the Western world, and more especially in places like, in the Philippines and elsewhere during World War II, and in Japanese prisoner of war camps.
Wow. So let's follow after the conclusion of the war between 1783 and 88, 89. There's, I think, an interesting chapter in American Freemasonry. There's, first of all, a growth in the number of lodges, but there's also a move towards what I would call a federalist kind of system,
Right.
State by state. Can you talk to us a little bit about what happens immediately after the war?
Right. So by the end of the war, there's about 135 lodges in the 13 states. By 1790, there's 200 lodges. By 1890, something like that. So there's this rapid growth. Obviously, it helps that George Washington as a Freemason is known, and numerous other general officers and signers of the Declaration of Independence. So Freemasonry achieves a level of status and support in the new federal society. And again, because it's also encouraging Republican virtues and teaching Republican virtues, and the men who are Freemasons are gaining credibility and legitimacy for them to take on greater roles in society and in their communities. And then the Grand Lodges, the several lodges in the various states, they were once under provincial Grand Masters appointed from Scotland or England. And they start to form their own independent Grand Lodges in the same way that the Anglican Church separated themselves from the Church of England and became the Episcopal Church in America. And to do that, they had to get a bishop who came over from Scotland, Bishop Seabury, who happened to be a Freemason. So these organizations in these various states formed themselves into Grand Lodges. And there are different forms of Freemasonry from England, Scotland, and Ireland, and they solely coalesced. And as they coalesced, they wrote their own constitutions, their state constitutions, their grand constitutions, and several of those states dedicated and sent those books to George Washington as a form of, as a sign that they are forming themselves into well-regulated, duly constituted organizations that are subordinate to a federal system. And most of them are ardent Federalists too.
But in theory, they could have created a Grand Lodge of the United States, and
Sure.
it never did.
Yeah, so there was a discussion at the end of the war about creating a general Grand Lodge or a general Grand Master of the United States to oversee all of Freemasonry in the United States. This had just happened amongst the Swedes, where they had put the King of Sweden as the Grand Master of all the various types of Freemasonry in the kingdom. And the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania proposed that as an idea, but the Massachusetts Freemasons rejected it pretty much outright because they weren't going to be subordinate to anybody, right? Pretty much after. And as a Massachusetts Freemasonry, I can tell you why. But so, so that is part of that was an attempt to create some sort of. But that office of General Grand Master, his job would have been to charter lodges into new territories like the Ohio country, and then he would have the right to call conventions to make sure that things were well regulated. And there were Masonic organizations like that today. The York Rite bodies of Freemasonry have that sort of confederation, and there are other fraternal organizations that have that sort of a national, international headquarters, but there's authority at the state level or even the national level.
In this moment, it's not related to George Washington's Masonic story, but we also see the emergence of Prince Hall Freemasonry. Could you say a word?
So Prince Hall Freemasonry is African American Freemasonry. In Prince Hall, it was a free African who lived in Boston from the 1730s to 1808, I believe. He's buried on Copp's Hill in North End. He was a leather dresser. I think he was also a chef or cook. He did sort of catering. He was very, very well known in Boston. And amongst the free African community there's a lot of disputes about this, but more recent scholarship and reviewing the documents real closely, he and 13 other men were initiated Freemasonry in an irregular fashion. Essentially, there was a sergeant who was in the Army who deserted from the Army, who was a Freemason, and he conferred the degrees on these men for a fee, which we call degree peddling, and it's been going on and still goes on, where if I've got a secret, if you give me $10, I'll tell you the secret. So they received the degrees of Freemasonry irregularly, but they were given permission to organize as a lodge by the local Freemasons. And then in 1787, they received a charter from the Grand Lodge of England that basically sets them up and duly establishes them. So any of the irregulars prior to that disappear because they're actually duly chartered by the Grand Lodge of England. So from that lodge of these free Africans in Boston, led by Prince Hall, that Freemasonry spread to Philadelphia, where Richard Allen and Absalom Jones were Freemasons, Rhode Island, New York, and then it spreads throughout the country. So there are Grand Lodges of Prince Hall Freemasonry throughout the United States. There are lodges throughout the United States. In most places in the United States, there's a recognition between predominantly black and predominantly white Grand Lodges. They meet together. In fact, they just had a great meeting. The oldest lodge in Virginia is Universal Lodge here in Alexandria, Virginia, and they met. They just had a joint meeting at Alexandria Washington Lodge 22 in Alexandria, which is Washington's lodge too. So there's a greater and greater connection between predominantly white, predominantly black Freemasonry, but there's no desire to merge those organizations because they have their same culture and their same identity and their own histories to them.
In that same period, in the 1780s, we also see the emergence of the Society of the Cincinnati.
Yes.
Is there any connection between Masonry and the Cincinnati? For those who are not familiar with the Cincinnati, a sort of veterans organization that emerges straight out of the war in 1783.
Right. I think that there's elements of Freemasonry in the Society of the Cincinnati, as there are elements in every fraternal organization that you've ever heard of or will ever hear of. But the society is a hereditary base, so you have to be the eldest son of the descendant of that officer who was in the Continental Army or Navy. So Freemasonry is open to all men. You don't have to have any relatives who are a member of the fraternity to join. So and it's not focused on one particular profession, such as the military or the Navy. So there were elements to it. And of course, Washington was the first president of the Society of Cincinnati. Henry Knox was also the first secretary of the society, I believe, and Henry Knox is largely held to be a Freemason, and there's some evidence that he was, but it's not a strong evidence that he was a Freemason before the war.
You mentioned the presidency of the Society of Cincinnati. Let's go to the presidency of the United States with
Okay.
George Washington, because this is a chapter of his Masonic history where things change a bit. Let's actually start with the inauguration.
Sure.
There's a Masonic connection there. What do we see?
So the Bible used at the inauguration of George Washington came from the local lodge, St. John's Lodge, which still owns the Bible today. That Bible was purchased and used in the lodge for many years before the inauguration. It was later used at the inaugurations, and I'm not going to remember why. I believe Calvin Coolidge, Dwight Eisenhower, and George Bush Sr. all used the obligation, took the obligation or the oath of office on that Bible. The Bible, so it's not a Masonic event, but there are several Freemasons involved who were on the balcony with Washington, and Chancellor Robert R. Livingston, who administered the oath of office to Washington, was then the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge, ancient provincial Grand Lodge of New York at the time. We later Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of New York when it became its independent. So there are plenty of Freemasons involved, but the event itself is not a Masonic event. It's the first event in the executive branch of the federal government.
Here in our region, there's a important Masonic event during Washington's presidency with the cornerstone laying ceremony. Tell us about that.
So that's again another curious event. It's perhaps the most important event in American Masonic history, and certainly the most celebrated, though was never really fully understood. We do know that there was a cornerstone ceremony done first for a ceremony done for the first milestone at Jones Point up the river for the District of Columbia, and then they did a cornerstone ceremony for the White House when it was started to be built, and that was done by the local lodge, which is now I think Potomac Lodge 5, if I'm not mistaken, in the District of Columbia. But there wasn't really any discussion of doing a ceremony for the U.S. Capitol. One of the commissioners, Daniel Carroll, was a very active Freemason and was interested in that. Even though his brother was the first Catholic bishop of the United States, he was active in Freemasonry. And they decided really the catalyst to have that cornerstone ceremony was the yellow fever epidemic that was happening in Philadelphia. And Washington was going to leave Philadelphia to take his family away from that epidemic, of which Alexander Hamilton got quite sick. So when he informed the commissioners that he was going to come home here, they decided this would be a good opportunity to do a ceremony since he was going to be in town. So
September 1793.
Right, that's right. So he was here in Mount Vernon. They organized a parade. They organized a celebration. The Freemasons in Alexandria and in the District of Columbia organized that and set up, and the ceremony was done, and Washington attended. There's a conjecture, there's always this common belief that he presided as Grand Master, when in fact he presided primarily as an esteemed and illustrious guest of Freemasonry, and of course as the President of the United States. But he did participate in the service ceremony by using the working tools to try the stone and that sort of stuff. But he wasn't the Grand Master Pro Tem. The Grand Lodge of Maryland, because it's Maryland territory, Masonically speaking, conducted the ceremony.
The presidency, when I chatted with you in advance and reading the book, you find out that Washington, as president, has a very different approach or relationship to Freemasonry than he would have, say, as a younger man. How would you characterize it?
Right. So when Washington was, more especially when Washington returned from the war in 1783, his membership was well known and widely known, and he was immediately invited both by Fredericksburg Lodge, his mother lodge, and Alexandria Lodge that had just formed here to attend lodge meetings. And he later did that in May of 1784. And he was happy to participate in the fraternity as a brother. But once he became the President of the United States, he was never asked to attend lodge, nor would he ever sit in a lodge, because he became the patron of the fraternity more than a brother of the lodge. And he had so many precedents and so many standards he had to set as president. And one of those things was he was setting the separation between what he was doing as the president of the United States versus what he would do as an individual, in the same way that royalty or the sovereign has a private relationship or private personality and the sovereign's personality or role, right? So I think that's part of what was going on there. So Washington, when he's president, he received numerous letters, books. When he traveled through the southern states, he was received by delegations of Freemasons in all the states. He was happy to receive them. He graciously received their gifts. He wrote nice letters, but he was not going to be subordinate in any fashion to those lodges. But only when he came back from the presidency, retired, he did return and sit in lodge with the brothers and his friends in Alexandria. So
I'm trying to decide whether I want to ask you about two more Masonic moments, but I think I'll just actually go to the very last one.
Okay.
Because I want to leave plenty of time for a conversation with the audience, our virtual audience as well, that's likely to ask questions. The funeral ceremony for George
Yes.
Washington. So we're now in December of 1799. When I here at Mount Vernon have participated in the observance of that day, Freemasons play a prominent role. Can you talk to us about Freemasons' engagement with the honoring of George Washington in 1799?
Sure. So Washington's, the three attending physicians too, Elijah Cullum Dick was the presiding master of the lodge here, and Gustavus Brown, I believe is his name, from Maryland, was also Freemason, who later became Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Maryland. The third Dr. President, James Craig, was not a Freemason, though he's often cited as such. So when Washington died, I think it's reasonable to assume that Elijah Cullum Dick, especially since he's the master of the local lodge, asked Martha or got permission to do a Masonic service as part of his funeral, which the widow would have consented on some sort of level. So, so you see the minute books, and the minute books, there's images in the book, and then more especially the minute books themselves are sitting in the lodge archives at the George Washington Masonic Memorial, where the lodge has the meetings, they're discussing about the funeral, they're making sure that they have all their equipment, they're sending out invitations to the lodge in the District of Columbia and letting other people know that this is going to happen. One brother is specifically charged to make sure that they have a traveling case so they can take their charter with them of the lodge, bring it down here to Mount Vernon. So the lodge.
Why would that be important?
What's that?
Why would bringing the charter be important?
Well, so it's a curious, that's sort of inside baseball stuff, but so often lodges can just open their lodge in their lodge hall and then travel wherever they want. But it's very clear by the minutes that they brought their charter with them, and they opened their lodge here, probably maybe in the Washington study or in the long room at Mount Vernon. So they actually opened the lodge here. And that again, it's a folk way. That's the way they do it, and it's good enough for them. So they opened up the lodge here, and then they have a prescribed Masonic service that is still largely used today. And if I thought about it deep enough, because I've done a few Masonic ceremonies, funerals in my time, I could probably remember some of the ritual. But essentially, you have Washington received a Christian burial according to the Book of Common Prayer, and then there was a Masonic service there, which essentially was the brothers gathering around to remember their departed brothers, to reassure the widow and the family that the fraternity was there in case there was trouble or any kind of need, and that there's sort of a charge to not worry about the bad things or the faults of the brother, but we should focus on the virtues that he exemplified in his life as a good and faithful brother, which is a remarkable thing, and sort of the title of the book, that people would be worried about sort of the faults of George Washington rather than the virtues for such a virtuous man. So the ritual then also concludes with commonly putting a sprig of evergreen on the casket, which is a reflect of immortality, and then prayers are given, and then so that service was written and organized and part of the Grand Lodge of Virginia's official ceremonies well before Washington died. And that service that the Grand Lodge of Virginia does today is probably, my guess is 80% similar to what was done in Washington's time. And it's very similar to what I did when I was master of my lodge in Massachusetts.
So let me ask one more question before we open it up to the room. Reading this book, and it's chapter by chapter, all of the documents related to George Washington and Freemasonry, many of them there to see in full color images. It's a really great achievement. But there are a lot of myths that you address. Sometimes you debunk, sometimes you sort of try to properly understand and contextualize in this book. What stands out to you? Is there a particular myth you might want to talk about in this room?
Well, we've already sort of talked about George Washington as the Grand Master of the United States. There's another idea that he declined to be Grand Master of Virginia during the war, which is not, there's not any truth to that. There's other stories about him participating in the fraternity, and I think there's also, especially after his death and in the 19th century, this idea that he renounced Freemasonry or that he decided he was not a Freemason. And that's clearly not true. He had some concerns about the fraternity maybe as he got older, and he had a lot of concerns about the way the country was going as he got older, and as he was finishing his second term in office. So it's reasonable to consider that, but he never renounced the fraternity. But he was never, again, active in it. And this is part of the balance that we deal with any kind of organization in a lot of different ways. First of all, we think that a member of an organization has to be active and they have to be out every night, or they have to give a lot of money to that organization, or they have to be seen in public as such or wearing bumper stickers or pins. When in fact, most of those organizations, it's a question of exhibiting the virtues and the character of that. So one doesn't need to necessarily go to a place of worship every week to be a strong person of faith, right? And so we often try to dispel Washington because he didn't go. It's clear that he only maybe attended 8 or 9 lodge meetings in his life, but obviously he exhibited the very virtues that the fraternity is predicated upon. And so profoundly did he exhibit those virtues that there's a huge giant memorial built 100 years ago where I work that is dedicated wholly to those virtues that Washington had exhibited as a man, as an American, as a Freemason. Yeah.
So while Stephen, and be showing your hands to Stephen, who's in the back of the room here, if you want to ask a question, or Ann may have a question too. Let me ask you very quickly, the George Washington Masonic National Memorial.
Yes.
I live here, so I see it. It's a very big building.
Right.
Can you tell the world about it?
So the George Washington Masonic Memorial Association, or the memorial, was founded in 1910 in conjunction with Alexandria Washington Lodge 22. It's an association organized and maintained by every Freemason in the United States. They raised enough money and had enough land to break ground in 1922. And next February, we're going to have a large celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Cornerstone Ceremony, which then in 1923 had something like 15,000 Freemasons. And next year, we hope to have thousands of Freemasons show up for the rededication. That memorial was built from 1922 and dedicated in 1932, which is the bicentennial of Washington's birth. Yeah. And that building has rooms for lodges to meet, but we all have exhibits on Washington. We have exhibits on Freemasonry. We have items from Washington's estate that Alexandria Washington Lodge 22 owns, including the trowel used by Washington at the cornerstone of the U.S. Capitol and the very portrait that Washington sat for the brothers of his lodge. It's on the cover of the book. So we're open. We're trying to be open more than 3 or 4 days a week, but we're trying to form more tour guides, as we know that can be difficult. But we have been dedicated, and our mission is to educate the public about the virtues and characters of George Washington, the man, the Mason, and the father of our country.
That's great.
Yes.
Beautiful building.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I see a question from the remote audience.
Yes, we do have some questions from online. So Jeranek Walter wants to know that in the book Cabal by Mark Edward Lender, I was shocked to learn all of the trouble a so-called brother named Horatio Gates was behind George Washington. Did you find any reactions from Washington or the Masons towards the Gates-Horatio scandal?
No. I'm vaguely aware of what that scandal is. I'm sorry. But Freemasonry and Freemasons are concerned with the welfare of each individual brothers and their families and maintaining the lodge and the work of the lodge, so we're not really interested or concerned with what else is going on in the larger world. So no, sorry.
Thank you.
I see a question from the room. Stephen's coming. One right there. Almost got it. There you go.
Sorry. In the same vein, I'm curious if this brotherhood accelerated perhaps the success of the revolution when Baron von Steuben, for example, arrived at Valley Forge. He was a brother from a lodge in Prussia. George Washington was a brother, obviously. And they had dinner together. Washington was very suspicious because of this cabal. And yet they had dinner together for the first 10 nights that the Baron arrived at Valley Forge. Are there examples that you've seen where maybe, Masonry accelerated, the success of the revolution?
Well, I don't see any examples of that. I don't know if there's any evidence. I've never seen any evidence that there was any Masonic meetings at Valley Forge. But as I said, I think that Freemasonry provides a point of contact. In the same way that I was born and raised in Iowa, if I meet another Iowan, I want to talk about where they're from in Iowa, if they family farms or where they went to college. But at a certain point, I don't like all Iowans, and not all Iowans like me. So we may move on to different topics. So I would imagine something like Baron von Steuben, there would be a lot to talk about military-wise, and Washington would be very interested to understand what the German army was, the Prussian system, Frederick the Great, all that sort of stuff. So Freemasonry might be a point of contact in the same way with Lafayette. So Lafayette was a Freemason before he came to the United States. We're very clear about what lodge he joined in Paris. But obviously, such things as war, sentiment only goes so far, and Freemasonry is fundamentally a sentimental organization. It's based on brotherly love, relief, and truth. And to conduct military operations and try to defeat the greatest military in the power in the world doesn't really have much room for sentimentality. It's too brutal of an occupation to give command and risk people's lives because you happen to be in the same fraternal lodge. We wouldn't credit that. I wouldn't want to credit that to anybody. And I think George Washington had seen enough brutality and warfare when he was a young man that he wasn't going to risk any person's life predicated on some sort of fraternal handshake. However sincere and profound it may be, it's still, you're risking lives and you're risking fortunes and their honors by that sort of stuff. So there's a fraternal relationship, but when the bullets start flying, there's a different type of fraternities going on, and that's fraternity of whether or not you're competent, fundamentally very competent. Yeah.
I see Ann in the back from the remote audience, and we'll come back to the room.
Yes, so Joy Grieg asks, was George Washington familiar with the writings of Hannah Crocker? Joy tells us that she was a woman in Boston who wrote about Freemasonry in her series of letters on Freemasonry.
Yes. George Washington would not have known of Hannah Crocker Mather, or Mather Crocker. No, Hannah Crocker Mather. But I know of her, and I know that she was a descendant of Cotton Mather, and I know that she formed a Masonic-like organization for women in Boston. I don't think it lasted more than a few years, but yes. So if a larger question is, were there women who are Freemason? There are women who are Freemason. There have been women in Freemasonry for 200 years. There's a lodge of women Freemason in D.C., of which the husband of one of those women was a Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of D.C. They're co-Masonic groups. They're anybody who gets a hold of the ritual, and anybody can get a hold of the ritual for the last 250 years, could call themselves Freemasons and organize a lodge, but there is a level of recognition according to the standards. And ancient craft Freemasonry, which I'm a member of, is for men and not for women. In the same way, it's not for atheists. You must believe in a supreme being to join Freemasonry. And it's not for criminals either. So,
Can you speak to the appendant lodges?
the appendant lodges?
Yeah, how they get formed and
Do you mean like
and
you mean like the other,
colors?
like the Scottish Rite and York Rite of Freemasonry?
Right.
So Freemasonry's central allegory is the building of King Solomon's Temple. And of course, if you read your Bible, and you should, then you know that the temple was destroyed. The Babylonian captivity happened. The return from Babylon, the second temple was built. And Freemasons took those stories of the destruction, the building of the second temple, as other allegories and created more rituals. And again, as I mentioned earlier, writing and performing rituals is a literary genre that was extraordinarily popular before 1920. And there were literally hundreds of fraternal organizations in the 19th century that performed rituals predicated on any type of legend and story, the same way that there are hundreds of operas or plays based on all sorts of other stories as well. So Freemasonry developed those rituals that discuss the destruction of the first temple, the Babylonian captivity, and the building of the second temple, and then also leads into Knights Templarism as a form of Christian Freemasonry, or Christians' relationship to the temple in Jerusalem. Those degrees and ceremonies were generated in the 1760s, 1770s, and came more and more in formal nature in the 19th century. The Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, though it's called Scottish, is an explosion of rituals in France in the 1700s that coalesced in the United States about 1801 into what is called the Scottish Rite under 33 degrees, the 33rd and last degree, of which I happen to be a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemason. So those degrees just exploded as people enjoyed doing them, in the sense that if you read the Bible every day in the 1820s and you got excited about seeing those kind of rituals performed and that kind of explanation, in the same way that Cecil B. DeMille made huge numbers of movies, and the first great movies made that were these stories, biblical stories, right up into Charleston Heston and the Ten Commandments and that sort of stuff. So that would have been an exciting thing to do, to be able to see those stories that you'd read in the Bible your whole life acted out in some sort of performance or pageantry. And then if there's some sort of secret word and grip that you could pretend that you were like the high priest, or that you were like Zerubbabel, or you could hold a trowel in one hand and a sword on the other as you rebuilt the second temple. That's a very romantic and a very exciting notion. And that was part of what made those rituals so important before 1930.
Let's go to a question from the virtual audience, and then I see a question in the front row, Stephen.
So we actually have a few people asking you to comment a little bit more about British and American Freemason interaction during and after the Revolution. More specifically, there's a question about whether or not you can talk about the return of Masonic Lodge chests from the Continental troops to the British.
Yes. So as I mentioned earlier, that the fact that you had these American soldiers in the Continental Army who were captured, but they were given a large charter when they were prisoners of war in New York, demonstrates that. And the story of the regalia being captured by the British and returned, I believe that happened, and I'm vague about this, but I believe that happened in New York State, in Western New York in a battle, maybe Saratoga. I'm not sure. It's often attributed to George Washington. Washington did not do that, but I think a British general did. So there is examples of that. There are plenty of examples of that relationship amongst Freemasons that goes on to this very day. So one of the curious things about the story about the creation of a General Grand Master of the United States in 1780 is that the idea would be that the Americans would talk about this. They would come up with a candidate who they would want to be the General Grand Master, and then they would submit that name to the British Grand Lodge for their approval, which is ironic, since they're in rebellion against the crown, but they're not in rebellion against the Grand Lodge of England, or Scotland. So there is this conversation that happens after the war about how independent they want to be, because it is a fraternity, it's a brotherhood. Why wouldn't we be in one? Why would we not united? And I don't think that the Americans after the war for independence hated the British. If they did, they would be changing the name of Prince William County and all sorts of other names too, like other people want to change today. So I don't know why. So there wasn't this animosity or hatred towards the British, and certainly Washington was happy to try and maintain a diplomatic relationship and reestablish trade. So it's only in part because I think the American Freemasons didn't want to send their dues to England or pay tribute to the Grand Lodge to maintain their viability that they formed their own independent Grand Lodges. But one of the interesting questions is those fraternal relationships continued to grow even during the War of 1812. And then one of the questions I'm curious about is did Freemasonry play a part in a diplomatic way when relationships were rebuilt after the War of 1812, leading up to when the Prince of Wales came and visited the United States in 1860. So Freemasonry has its own unique things and their own way of doing things, but it is a fraternal organization. So there is a negotiation there, just how far independent we want to be and how close we want to be. That's what we have in America. That's why we have a democratic republic,
I think we'll let this be our last question as we're coming up at the 8 o'clock hour.
Thank you. Listen, Mark, thanks very much. I was fascinated when you said that Masonic principles affected the sense of America as a republic. Could you elaborate on that? And more to the point, were many of the members of the Constitutional Convention Freemasons, And is there evidence that Masonic principles filtered into those discussions and into the structure and content of the founding documents, in
Right.
addition to the overall vision at that
Sure.
time?
A very important British Masonic historian named John Hamill wrote, "There's nothing original in Freemasonry except the assembly of the several parts." So Freemasonry borrows everything from all sorts of other institutions. It borrows from the Bible, it borrows from stonemasonry, it borrows heavily, and is influenced and is a product or fruit of the Enlightenment period. So the very principles and ideas that are in the Constitution were being talked about and discussed and part of Masonic constitutions going back to Anderson's Constitution 1723. So there is something like 13 or 15 signers of the U.S. Constitution are Freemasons, but the level of commitment and participating in the fraternity varies. And so like anything else, any other organization, it's really a question of how much did they know. So Washington, according to the book, he received several books. He was fairly well conversant in the jargon of the fraternity and the symbolism of it. But whether or not it inculcated his mind and it influenced him is a difficult thing. And that's always the trouble with anything. So there are plenty of people, my family is half Norwegian, and I've got about 5 Norwegian words in my head that I can say that my grandmother taught me, but I probably maybe exhibit other Norwegian characteristics, like blue eyes or something like that. So how that impacts is difficult to say. I think Freemasonry was a spice or a flavor in that mix, but it wasn't a main ingredient. It was part and parcel of that story, and certainly men were reading those books and it was part of that literature of that area, but it wasn't something central to any of those people's lives. Benjamin Franklin is another example where he was very active in Freemasonry when he was a young man. He knew Freemasonry maybe better than anybody else of his time period, because he visited lodges in England and in Scotland and France when he was in the diplomatic service there. But he was an extraordinary human being in so many ways that Freemasonry was not central to his life. So I think Freemasonry, as I said, was an ingredient. It provided a flavor to it. It provides a means to begin a friendship, but it's not central in the way that Rousseau, Voltaire, other writers, other philosophies, the Bible, would have impact on that. So,
Well, Mark Tabbert, thank you for writing this book on George Washington and Freemasonry. Please join me in welcoming and thanking Mark Tabbert to Mount Vernon.
yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Freedom Blueprint.